Look at the countries around the world that don't have a free press. What do you have there? You have dictators, you have autocrats, you have a system of suppression. Democracy does not function without a free and independent press. It doesn't.
Welcome to Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff, where we interview newsmakers, storytellers, and all-around interesting people. Sit back, relax, unless you're driving, and enjoy the show. Here's Jackson.
Hello. I am Jackson Huff. This is Not in a Huff. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, really appreciate it. This week, I'm interviewing Mark Albert. Now, Mark is someone from the world of journalism. He's worked across the world when it comes to being a correspondent for several different big news agencies. He's worked on some really powerful stories. We're going to talk a little bit about that. He's won some prizes and done some really powerful work when it comes to just uncovering some bad things that were happening. He's also worked in other countries when it comes to teaching journalism to countries that maybe don't have as strong of a background in it. He taught journalism in several countries that are a little bit oppressive when it comes to journalism, and he taught how to be fair and balanced and that type of thing as well. He's someone also who is beginning to offer classes and programs when it comes to how to be more media savvy. He's going to give some really insightful information on just how to get your name out there and the mistakes that a lot of people make when it comes to being media savvy. I really enjoyed our conversation just to hear his stories about traveling the globe with journalism, his stories about helping journalists in countries that journalism isn't as strong. His stories about just helping families get answers to some really tragic situations. So I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Be listening very closely to him talking about a upcoming event that he's having on Mastering the Media from September the 12th to September the 14th in Washington, D.C. He would love to see you there in whatever capacity you can be. This is a fun conversation. Always got to say it. If you listen, you like it, go follow along. Leave a written review. Go follow on Instagram, Spotify, all those type of places. But we'll get right to the interview. Here is Mark Albert. Mr. Albert, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to let you do the heavy lifting. Just introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Mark Albert. I was a journalist for 25 years. That's a quarter century. I've got the gray hair to prove it if it comes through on the camera. And for those listening, just trust me, I have the gray hair. And I was on air at CBS News, and I created and led a national investigative unit for Hearst Communications. They have TV stations, radio, newspaper, digital across the country. And then I stepped away from journalism last year. So if you're listening on this podcast in the future, that was 2023. And now I have my own media consulting firm. So I do media training, crisis communications, and I help people match up with journalists. So journalists are always looking for experts. Experts are always looking for journalists. Sometimes they don't know how to connect. And so I help them do that.
No, I love that. And I want to, you've done so much. I want to dive into some of it, but I first have to say, and the podcast listeners have heard me say this before, I've had people on that are in broadcasting, people from CNN and MSNBC. I've had people on that, their whole life is, voiceover. You have such a nice, crisp, clean, great journalism voice. And it just makes me think, man, people have to listen to my voice every week, and they get to listen to you just for 1 week. So thank you for that.
Well, Jackson, I'll tell you what, I'm happy to record your ringtone for your cell phone or your voicemail. And then you'll get sick of my voice, as I'm sure many viewers have over 25 years.
I first want to ask you, because I've never talked to anyone who's kind of done war journalism. And I know that you were in embed, I believe, during the Iraq war. So what was that like? I feel like that's a strange thing, because as a journalist, I feel like that has to be kind of a position that people would want to have, because, right in the action, being able to do the news from there is a cool thing, but it's also a scary thing personally. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, my parents sure did not want me to go. I'll tell you that. So I went twice with U.S. troops in Iraq. I embedded twice. Once in 2005, when Iraq was about to have their first ever democratic elections. That was January of 2005. I embedded with the Navy and the Marines. And so we were on an aircraft carrier and various vessels and on the oil platforms just off the southern coast of Iraq and all of that as they were supporting defense in the skies. And then in 2011, I went back, and that was the withdrawal of all American troops from Iraq in August, September of 2011. And so that was really in the heart of where a lot of the violence had been. And I recall a couple of nights where, and especially one night where we were in an MRAP, which is one of these big up-armored vehicles, and you're strapped in. You basically can only move your head because you're strapped in so much. And we had to drive 8 hours in the desert, and we had to get to Baghdad. Now, in the end, we ended up taking a helicopter for the last part of it because we just couldn't get where we needed to go for various reasons. But, you're strapped in there. They tell you how to do a tourniquet. They give you some anti-IED training. But you know what? To be honest, Jackson, I had stories to do. We had video to edit, and I was writing in the middle of the night in these MRAPs. I didn't have time to be scared. You have to put it out of your mind and you have to focus on the job. And the job is to tell the audience back home what's happening. And so we had a series of stories. I think we did 7 or 8. We reported live from Baghdad. And let me tell you, that is quite a trip to say, reporting live from Baghdad, Mark Albert, now back to you. And so that was quite interesting. But the men and women that we were embedded with were so brave. The second time was the Army National Guard, and specifically units from Minnesota. I was reporting for the ABC affiliate in Minneapolis at the time, KSTP. And they were so brave, obviously protecting us and them and being away from their families. I got to go home after 3 weeks. We were there for 3 weeks. They were there for, I think it was up to a year. And so they were really doing the heavy lifting. All we were doing was really telling their stories. But if I may, Jackson, there is a tie to Iraq that I'll never forget. And this was before I ever went over there. September 11th, 2004, there was a Navy corpsman assigned to some Marines, and his name was David Cedergren. And he was at a base in the Scandia, Iraq. And around 2 a.m. one day, September 11th, 2004, he was taking a shower. And he was found dead in that shower. And he told his they told his family, the military did, they were back in Minnesota, that he died of an undiagnosed heart ailment. Now, 4 years later, the Pentagon decided to reopen that case and 18 other cases of service members who had died, but perhaps the full story was not disclosed to their families. And I remember interviewing Dave Cedergren's father the day of that announcement. And I remember thinking, I can't believe that this family doesn't really know all the information about their loved one's death 4 years later. And so, I get really curious. That's the hallmark of a journalist. And I asked the Pentagon and NCIS for the investigation of his death, those records, anything they had, autopsy. My request got denied after about 6 months, and we appealed, and we fought that, and we won. And Jackson, when we got that file back, it showed that when it rained at that base in Iskandariyah, Iraq, sparks would jump up from the ground. Why? Because of exposed wiring and electrical failure. That other Marines and service members had been burned in that very shower where Dave Cedergren was found dead, that they had to send people home from Iraq because of the injuries. And when the base commanders were asked, well, how in the world did you find repair people to try and fix the electrical problems? They actually told investigators they just went with the oldest electricians they could find. Why? Because they figured if they lived that long, they must know what they were doing. No certifications, no training, just if they lived that long, they must know what they were doing. We got to the bottom of it, and we proved that it was actually electrocution. He didn't die only of an undiagnosed heart ailment. We got answers for that family, and the military changed the way they track the remains of every U.S. service member killed around the globe as a result of our series. And I keep in touch with the family today. So, I've been to Iraq twice, but that was by far the most memorable tie that I have to Iraq. And coming up this September will be 20 years since Dave Cedergren died. Their family is my thought.
That's an amazing story, and just yet another example of why journalism and those investigations are so important for sure. And at a time that some people don't necessarily always love the mainstream media, it just shows you why it's really important that they exist for sure. I want to now kind of we've got sure
if I may just real quick, we won a Peabody Award, essentially the Pulitzer Prize of broadcast journalism for that series. And the Minnesota National Guard, when I left Minnesota after 8 years, gave me the Superior Civilian Service Award. First time they'd ever given it to a journalist. And I would simply say that for those who accuse journalists of being slanted or biased or fake news, democracy does not function without a free and independent press. It doesn't. Look at the countries around the world that don't have a free press. What do you have there? You have dictators. You have autocrats, you have a system of suppression. And so we need to treasure the free press and the journalists in this country because they are part of what makes America, part of what makes us a democracy, and part of what keeps us free. So thank you for your work.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And I want to kind of now take a step back. So we've got you doing this, Peabody Award-winning journalism, this really impactful things. But let's take a step all the way back. And I want to know what got you inspired to be a journalist. Obviously you wound up being a very successful one, but that comes from normally a kid, whether you're doing your, some press briefings in your room as a kid, or whether it was, in college and realizing, hey, this journalism thing is something I'm good at. Talk about where that inspiration first came from.
Well, you hit it closer than you may know. 11 years old, I was a kid. And I took my allowance money and I bought the Sunday subscription to the Los Angeles Times. We lived in Southern California. And I also started watching the local news when I was 11. In high school, I started a TV production club and we'd do one newscast a quarter. And I still thought, well, what am I going to do when I grow up? Maybe I'll be an English teacher. And we went to a prospective student orientation at USC, University of Southern California. Go Trojans, fight on for all those listening. And I took one session on English, one session on education. My mother was with me. And I said, what's the third and last session we should take? And she was like, well, come on, silly. Journalism, of course. And so we went to this session and we heard the former USC students who are now reporters and producers and anchors. And I remember turning to my mom and saying, that's exactly what I want to do with the rest of my life. And it was the energy that I got from learning a piece of information, learning some facts, and telling people before they knew. I can remember, Jackson, in 1992, the presidential election between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton and Ross Perot. And I'm sitting in front of the television as the results come in, and I'm adding up electoral college votes. Not voters' votes, right? Because those don't really matter in the end, but it's the electoral college votes. And I can remember running and telling my mom, who was in the kitchen, and my dad was in the garage, okay, President Bush is up by 5, and now Bill Clinton's up by 13. I just was always insatiably curious, and I always wanted to tell people first, like the town crier. And so I was just very, very curious at an early age, and that's what made the spark. And I never changed after I applied to USC and the journalism school, never changed my major.
No, I love that. And, we talked beforehand about not making this podcast divisive, but the only thing I can do that about is sports. And USC, obviously they're joining the Big Ten. As you see, I'm an IU graduate and I'm a Notre Dame fan. So USC is not my favorite, but we'll move on.
I'm trying not to touch that at all. All I'll say is go Trojans, go USC, and long live the Pac-10. Excuse me, Pac-12. Excuse me, Pac-2.
Well, that's a whole other thing. I talked to right before the Pac-10, Pac-12, went away. I talked to because the Pac. I'm going down a different road, but yeah, there's a lot of issues there. Let's move into before talking to you. I wrote the question: what was maybe the most impactful story? What was the most meaningful experience you've had? I believe that you may have very well have already shared it, because if you've got another one, then that's amazing too. But talk a little bit about some of the really, really cool experiences you've had outside of obviously something that, gave a family some closure.
Right. In that series about Dave Cedergrant certainly did that. It was the most impactful story that I've ever done. But you're right. As a journalist, we travel a lot. We talk to people that we normally wouldn't. I sat in the White House during President Obama's news conferences. I've reported from the North Lawn of the White House, from the Supreme Court, from the Capitol. But you know what? I've also done a story about cheese in Taiwan for CBS News. And I've done a story about Martian potatoes in Peru for CBS. And I did a story about General MacArthur from Australia. And I dangled my legs off of America's oldest lighthouse, the top of it, where tourists aren't allowed to go. And I've had such amazing memories and amazing experiences. And I've told thousands and thousands of stories. And, some you remember pretty fondly and pretty closely, and others sort of time washes away a bit. But I will say that I have traveled, thanks to journalism, all over this great country and really many places around the world. And I honestly, Jackson, wouldn't change a thing. I wouldn't. If I had to do it all over again, I would still be a journalist.
I love that. And I want to talk about your travels in a second. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about, the impact you're making on journalists in other countries. I believe that you've trained some journalists in other countries. You've already talked a little bit about how journalists are so important and, free press is so important. I believe that you've trained some journalists in some countries that maybe that isn't as a bedrock to their society. So talk a little bit about that training that you've done and then maybe the differences, with journalists outside of the United States.
Well, I give you a little bit of foreshadowing when I mentioned that I sort of thought maybe I'd be an English teacher early on. And I used to pretend teach my sister, who was several years younger. I'd get the chalk and the chalkboard. So I have found a lot of meaning in teaching. And so in 2016, through a State Department program, I went to Pakistan and I created a 2-week news production course and I taught it to journalists in Pakistan. And since 2017, almost every year, I've gone to Vietnam and I teach in newsrooms across Vietnam. And you're spot on. These are countries that, Vietnam is a socialist communist country, right? They have state censored media. And yet the journalists there are trying to adopt Western principles of journalism, best practices. They want to know how we do it here in the West and in the US, and they look to us as the gold standard. And so every year, what the top network there, the top television network, gives me a topic. Last year was fact checking. So I create a 3-day course, on fact checking, and I teach it in various newsrooms there. And in Pakistan, it was general news production. So every single thing from how do you pitch a story, how do you find stories, how do you shoot a story on your camera, your iPhone, how do you deliver it, how do you write, how do you do a news conference. And again, Pakistan, journalism there, when I went, was sort of the wild, wild west. And so you really have to realize that in many parts of the world, America and American journalism are a beacon to others about how to report information, how to keep their citizens and their communities informed. And it's very, very amazing, the reception that I get when I go overseas to teach journalism. I'm very, very grateful. And I was an adjunct professor at Northwestern University and teaching graduate students there. And they always, always impressed me. We have some great future journalists coming up.
Well, that's good to hear for sure. And I wonder, you talk about teaching journalism in Vietnam, a country that, the press is not necessarily free. So what does that look like? You have to teach that integrity. You have to teach the only thing which is to get to the bottom of the story. But maybe the government's not going to necessarily allow that to some regard. So how do you balance that?
Well, that's a great question. So I never had anyone tell me you can't teach X. Now, that being said, you're very aware of the environment you're in. And so, the only area I really didn't touch was politics, right? That's sort of off limits. But, whether it's holding a small business owner accountable through your journalism there, or, it's tracking an increase in traffic, or, laws not being followed or something, I just taught what I know. And I taught the curriculum I designed, and the curriculum had been approved when I was teaching it, so I really had no interference. Now, I certainly can't speak to whether everything I taught was implemented or followed, but the reception was really, very kind, very opening, very embracing. And I would always assign assignments. And, I was very impressed by the assignments that were turned back. And I hope that it made a difference.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of pivot a little bit. And you talked about how you've traveled to so many places, and I assume a good chunk of them is because of, your career in journalism. But I know you've kind of got a passion for mistake fares and cheap budget travel. That's right up my alley too. If you look at some of the other podcasts I've done, I've talked to tons of people in the travel world. So I want to ask you just a little bit about maybe some of those places that you've been able to travel to because of some of these cheap fares.
Well, Jackson, I want to get to every country in the world. Now, I've only been to 86, which means I've got 110 to go. So I'm not even halfway there and the clock's ticking. So I've got to get going. The pandemic kind of set me back a little bit. But, I just have, like I mentioned, this insatiable curiosity. And I think there are so many amazing places in the world, and I want to see as much as I can. And so I could not afford to take 2 weeks and spend $5,000 every time if I wanted to travel. So the way I approach it is travel tapas, essentially small little bites of places, culture, food, people, experiences. And so I go for 3 or 4 days, and I, try to go as cheaply as possible. Now I'm not, sleeping in a park or anything, but I've done hostels and I've done cheap hotels and flash sales and all that. Some of my great airfare deals, $292 round trip to Australia, 400 and something to Japan, 202 to Muscat, Oman overnight. And, on and on and on. And so one of the great limiting factors, I think, for most people is they say, oh, I want to go to London. And they get the time off work and their spouse gets the time off work and they find a place to put the dog and they're going to take the kids out of school, and all that stuff. And then they start looking and they book the hotel. And like, okay, now we need to find airfare. Wrong. I want you to consider doing it 180 degrees difference. I want you to find the fare, the destination, and then book everything else. So you find the ticket that you want. Let's say it's a flash sale to, New Zealand. There was a flash sale in Delta last year, 40,000 some miles round trip to New Zealand. Normally it's over 100,000, right? You want to book that immediately. Don't ask your spouse, your doctor, your babysitter, your boss, book it. And you're like, Mark, we can't do that. The tickets are non-refundable. Aha. Here's the trick. In 2011, the then Obama administration passed a rule through the Department of Transportation that says airlines that market to U.S. consumers have to do one of two things. Either they have to let you put the price on hold for 24 hours, or they have to let you cancel for a full refund within 24 hours. Now, today, almost every airline does the latter. So you can book it and cancel for a full refund within 24 hours. Now, the rule only applies to airlines that market to U.S. consumers, but in practice, Expedia, Orbitz, Priceline, those big online travel agencies have adopted that. So, Jackson, if you see a fare for $400 to Australia, just book it right now. Don't tell anybody. Don't ask for permission, right? Because you then have 24 hours to find out if you can take it, if you can get the time off work, et cetera. Delta's rule is actually the most generous, and that is until midnight of the following day, you have to cancel for a full refund. So if you book the ticket at 1 a.m., you've got 47 hours to figure out if you can go. So that's my trick. And that's what I've used to be able to travel so much is I just book it when I see the deal and I'm looking for deals everywhere. And then I decide if I can go. And if I can't, I cancel the ticket. No harm, no foul.
Well, you've given us really good advice when it comes to the 24-hour window. But yeah, as far as the other stuff, you're speaking of the choir there. I've even taken a step further just because tons of people always ask me, because I'm the same way. I went to Iceland for $100 round trip. I'm always finding these deals as well. And people always ask, how did you do that? The biggest thing is one thing you mentioned, which is don't be so set on dates. If you have this date to this date, you've already set yourself up for paying too much. You've got to be flexible. And I'm flexible on destination. I'm not just like, I want to go to London on the 25th of August. It's like, sometime in August, I want to go somewhere in Europe, and you can find something a lot cheaper. And if you're in mainland Europe, that's another thing I always like to say, go anywhere in mainland Europe. Definitely, if you can find a German location, the trains, you can get to where you want to go probably just by train for $20. So
there was a flash sale on Air France a couple of months ago from Chicago, $200 round trip to Dublin, Ireland. Now, I've already been to Dublin and I've already been to Ireland, but guess what? I booked 2 of those tickets. And I got, I'm from Dublin now. I have a $189 round trip to, I think it's Belgrade, Serbia. And then I haven't decided where I'm going to go for the other one. So I'm nesting the trips, right? So I've got the trip to Ireland and then nested in the middle of that, I'm going to go somewhere. So can you imagine $200 to Ireland, and I'm using miles to get to Chicago, and $189 to go to this other country? And so like you talked about, don't think of it as I don't want to go to Ireland or I don't want to go to Germany. You're positioning yourself across the Atlantic where intra-European travel is so much cheaper.
Absolutely. Yeah. We just in August went to, our flight was actually to Czech Republic, to Prague. But in that, we also went to Vienna, Austria. We also went to Slovakia, and we also went to Poland. So you can go all over the place. So I love that. And my listeners have heard this so many times. I swore I wasn't going to say this, but you set me up too well. So I've got to tell you, my goal was, I'm 33 years old now, but my goal was to get to 15 countries before I turned 30. So I was 29 years old. I had been to 13 countries. I really needed these last two countries. So no matter what happened, I was getting to these. I was turning 30 that June. It was February. I had to get to my last two countries. So it was February of 2020. So some things were starting to get ready to happen. So February 2020, for March 12th, I decided I was going to Portugal and Spain. And that's what I did. I was supposed to go with my father. He wasn't even able to go. I went by myself on this trip, which I never do, but I had to get to these countries. So, what is this COVID thing? It's something's happening, but I'm going anyways. I was in Spain, and this is why you set me up so well. You talk about these tapas vacations you go on. I was on a tapas tour, enjoying myself, and I get a notification that Donald Trump had done a travel ban from Europe. I'm in Spain. I'm in Europe by myself. I have to call the State Department, make sure I'm going to be able to get back. All of the flights are being canceled. Almost got myself stuck in Europe. So it was quite the ordeal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What a
it all
story.
worked out just fine.
I actually was in India, and I got back, and 6 days later, the world shut down. So I just got back right before it happened.
It was interesting, but I've been telling the story for the last 4 years, so I guess I've got something to talk about now. Again, pivot. We've got to do that because you've got so much that you've done, so much you've accomplished, and that is, let's pivot to you reinventing yourself into something else. And before we kind of talk about what you pivoted into with your media advisory experts, I want you now just to tell people a little bit about, I guess, how you were able to do that, because there's a lot of discomfort in the world in making those changes and pivoting into something else. In a much smaller regard, we were just talking about travel, changing your plans, not knowing what's happening. That scares people. It definitely scares people to completely change their career, change what they're doing. So talk about how you were able to, I guess, be okay with that discomfort for a minute.
It's so funny. What a perfect question. Just today, I read a quote from Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. And it really spoke to me because it explains what I've done now 3 times in my life in reinventing myself. And here's the quote. I'll read for your listeners. He says, "There comes a time in every life where the past recedes and the future opens. It's that moment when you face the unknown. Some will turn back to what they already know. Some will walk straight into uncertainty. I can't tell you which one is right, but I can tell you which one is more fun." And I agree with Phil Knight. I didn't even know you were going to ask me this. I just happen to have the quote up on my desktop here. And I have walked into that uncertainty, and 3 times. This is the 3rd time in my life. And I have no regrets. No regrets. My grandmother, when she was dying, she could barely speak, and she whispered the words, "No regrets." In other words, live with no regrets. And so it's scary to reinvent yourself. It's scary to quit your job, the safety of that, and I have just felt this calling sometimes to do something different, or that curiosity is pulling me in a different direction. And I don't know what I'm doing all the time, right? I'm hanging on sometimes by the seat of my pants, figuring it out. But I've just always been very blessed or lucky or whatever you want to say, in that I have found a way. And so I left journalism after 25 years. It's so hard to say those words. I stepped away. And it just naturally ended up that people started calling me, asking me, "Can you do media training? Can you advise me on crisis communications? Can you do these other things?" And so I just naturally started doing it. And now it's been a year, and Media Advisory Experts is almost about a year old. That's our company, MediaAdvisoryExperts.com. And I've been so fortunate to meet so many people. Last week, I was doing media training for 300 election administrators from across the country. They're being faced with unprecedented levels of threats and disinformation and misinformation. And they need to know how to communicate with the public about how that our elections are safe, secure, and transparent. The week before that, Jackson, I was in Atlanta speaking to the National Campus Safety Summit and conference there about how to deal with crisis communications when the crisis comes to your campus, being transparent and open with the media and the public. And so I'm trying to convey that there are ways to craft a message and ways to be transparent. You don't have to hide in your bunker, and that sunshine is often the best disinfectant, as we hear often. And so that's what I'm doing now, and I've been very fortunate to do it. And I'm super excited. We're going to have our first live event coming up in a couple of weeks if you want to talk about that. And so I would encourage anyone, if you have a message, if you want to amplify your message, I'd love for you to reach out.
Yeah, and I do want to ask you about that event in a moment, but I first want to ask you, you talked about being able to get that exposure, and I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. So what advice do you have to people that struggle with exposure, and then they either struggle with it or they finally get it and then they just ruin it and they don't use it? So talk about some tips there.
Well, I'm going to say something so controversial that some of your listeners are probably going to scratch their head in befuddlement. So here goes. For anyone who's looking to get media attention and amplify your message in the media, I want you to stop pitching your company, stop pitching your brand, stop pitching your product. And this is about the point where people are like, it's like the record scratch, right? They don't know wait a minute, what am I supposed to pitch if I'm not pitching my company, my brand, or my product? I want you to start pitching your expertise. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that I'm a realtor, right? And I've got a small realty office. Maybe I'm in Omaha, Nebraska. And maybe it's just me. Maybe I've got 3 other realtors, right? Do you know what I'm doing right after the National Association of Realtors earlier this year announced a blockbuster settlement that will change the way we all buy and sell homes? Do you know what I'm doing? I'm not calling up the local TV stations, the newspaper, the radio, and saying, hey, tell people I sell homes, I buy homes, I'm a realtor. Of course not. I'm not even advertising that I'm, got a special right now. You know what I'm doing? I'm sending a note to these stations saying, here are top 3 things that every seller needs to know in this new market. Here are the top 5 things buyers need to know before they get a realtor in this new environment. You are adding value to the audience by sharing your expertise. Journalists need experts. Experts need journalists. So let's put them together. So please stop pitching your product, your company, your brand. That might be why nobody is calling. Instead, you need to be proactive. Don't wait for the journalist to get a hold of you. You need to reach out, but you need to do so with story pitches that add value to their audience. Forget the news release. Jackson, don't send out a news release unless you're Apple, okay? I want you to craft a personal pitch with value that you can add. If I'm a financial advisor, I'm sending out a pitch before December 31st. Here are top 5 things you need to do right now to save money on your taxes before New Year's Eve. And before April 15th, I'm sending out another one. Top 3 things to do to save money now on your taxes. Don't give the IRS more than they deserve, right? These are ways that you can add value to what a journalist is working on. And I wish more people would do that, because I'll tell you, in 25 years, I've deleted thousands and thousands of news releases. I don't understand it. And they're not tailored to me. They're not tailored to the coverage area that I'm doing. It's a waste of time. Instead, how can you add value?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a real world example of that. I work in higher education in admissions and advising, and we had 2 different seminars. One was, and the first one we offered food. We had an entire catered dinner, and it was basically explaining what our college did for adult learners and why you should go back to school. So it was catered towards why you should go back to our individual school. Wasn't well attended. We even had dinner. But guess what was well attended? That we had no dinner, and it was in the middle of the day. It was a seminar at a library. Instead of explaining why you should come to our school, it was a seminar explaining the difficulties of going back to school for adult learners and how to navigate those difficulties. Nothing about us. If you wanted to hear more about us at the end, sure, we would tell you. But people care more about, okay, I don't know if I want to go to you guys, but I definitely am struggling to figure this out as an adult that, has kids and a family and all that kind of stuff. So I've got a real world example for you for sure, because people care a lot more about that than a sales pitch. So I like that.
Absolutely.
I want to now just allow you to talk about, that live event that you have coming up.
Oh, I'm so excited. It's the most fun that I'm doing right now. Just an exciting project. It's called Media Mastery Experts Live, right? So my company is Media Advisory Experts. We advise you. But in this training, we're calling it Media Mastery Experts because I want you to master your message and master the media. It's 2 days in September 2024. So if your listeners are listening to this after those dates, don't you worry. We're going to have more. Just go to mediaadvisoryexperts.com and click on events. But for those of you who will hear this before September 12th, we're doing an amazing multi-day immersive event. So we're going to bring you to DC, right? You're coming to DC. We've got guest speakers on how the media works, how to craft your message, how to craft a story pitch to get a journalist's attention. We've got an expert on personal branding and marketing. We've got a former main television anchor in Los Angeles who is now a coach on camera. She's going to teach body language, voice, intonation, how to read a teleprompter, how to be on camera. We've got the head of a speakers bureau coming if you have ever wanted to get paid and booked to speak. And then you're going to take all of that and you're going to put it into practice. You're going to sit on set with me in a television studio a block from the White House, and we're going to do an on-camera interview. And then you're going to go right next door and you're going to do a podcast. And then you're going to go on a stage and deliver your message from that lecture. And we're going to record all this in video. Our attendees will get all this video. The VIPs will get edited clips for their social platforms and a 2-minute edited sizzle reel. So they can send that to a journalist. They can send it to a speakers bureau, et cetera, put it on their website. And those VIPs also get one-on-one coaching with me on the extra day, the 15th of September. So if you're interested, 2 ways to get more information. First, go to our event website, mediamasteryexperts.com, mediamasteryexperts.com, or just text the word media to 33777. That's 33777. Text the word media. I'll not only send you information about the event, but you'll also get my 6 tips to become a better public speaker. That's texting media to 33777.
I'll put that on the show notes too. But I mean, we could talk forever, but we're running out of time. But I have to ask you, just because it lines up so well with a previous guest, you were in, you were in the showcase of Price is Right. What year was that?
1996. I was on The Price is Right, and I'm very proud to say I won the Showcase Showdown.
There you go. I think 1996, because I interviewed the announcer from The Price is Right, but I think that he was from 2000 to like 2007. So I don't think.
God rest his soul. It was Rod Roddy at the time and Bob Barker.
Yeah, the person I interviewed was right after Rod Roddy. So I wondered whether he had announced you, but it sounds like not necessarily. But no, I really, really appreciate your time. Like I said, I think that we could talk a lot longer about a lot more things. You're doing so much, but all of your information will be in the show notes, and I really, really appreciate you.
Well, thanks so much, Jackson. And I only have one last thing to say to your listeners. Go USC Trojans.
Luckily, I have the editing power, so we'll see if that lasts. So that was Mark Albert. Really, really amazing guy. I learned a ton about being media savvy. The advice that he gave, he said some of it would be counterintuitive, and I agree with that. But I really, really think what he's saying makes sense. So if you want to hear more from him, again, go to that training, sign up for the next one if that's too soon, but September the 12th to the 14th in Washington, D.C., that media advisory training. I think that you can learn a whole heck of a lot. But yeah, man, his stories are just really powerful. I think that in a time where journalism and the media is scrutinized extra heavy, in the past we always thought, okay, it was on the news, it was true. Some people don't think that now. I think that what he had to say in that regard, and being true and honest and straightforward was really powerful. So I appreciate his words there. I appreciate him taking us around the world when it comes to his journalism, his reporting. He's reported on some really, really powerful stuff. And, the course of a journalist means that you report on some silly stuff too. So I appreciate him talking about that. I really, really, really enjoyed having Mark on. Go follow along with him. The links will be in the show notes to his training. The links will be in the show notes to his website. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, or you haven't already, follow along on Spotify or Apple. Leave a written review on Apple. That helps a lot. Leave a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify if you're a true rock star. Appreciate that very much. Follow along on Instagram, Not Enough Podcast, JacksonHuff.com, Not Enough with Jackson Huff on Facebook. Lots of places to follow along. A lot of amazing guests in the past and lots of really, really amazing ones coming up. So hope to see you next week. Take it away, Chris.
This has been Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff. Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next time, where we will interview another amazing guest who is sure to make you laugh or make you think. Or, hey, maybe even both. But until then, keep being awesome.